Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to Triggered Precision Machine. Today we have episode number 4 of the Precision Rifle Reloading series. Today is all about gunpowder. Everything from what powder to use, how much of it to use, etc., etc. We're going to go through how to select our starting charge weight, how to select our incrementally increasing charge weights for an optimal charge weight test for our load development, and then we're going to talk about some of the do's and don'ts as far as some cautionary things to try to make this process as safe as possible. Before we get started today, if you guys missed episode number 3, that was all about brass preparation, and that takes us up to where we are right now. So it might be worthwhile for you guys to take a look at that episode just so you're caught up and you know exactly what we're dealing with. Before we get started, there's one very important thing that we need to do. We still need to prime our brass. Our brass is freshly prepped. It's beautiful. All the necks have been sized and ran through the expanding mandrel, so we have hopefully really good consistent neck tension, and the last thing we have to do is prime them before we dump the powder in them. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to throw some primers in the bottoms of our cases, and to do that I'm just going to use a very simple hand priming tool and some small rifle primers because we're using the Pua brass. And we're going to get that done, and after that we're going to jump on the computer real quick and look at some resources that I use to determine a starting powder charge and possibly a max powder charge. So let's get started with the priming. Alright guys, before we get started priming, I'll just go over the tools that I use for the process, and I keep it very simple. I've used this RCBS hand priming tool for decades. This thing has lasted forever. There's really nothing in the tool itself that can break as long as you use it with a little bit of respect. So this thing's loaded tens and tens of thousands of cases. So there's that, and then we're going to use CCI number 400 small rifle primers. If you have bench rest primers, the BRs, those are fine too. Just make sure that obviously the primer matches whatever the case accepts. So don't try to shove a large rifle primer into a small primer pocket. That's should be pretty obvious. So to do this, very simple. All we do is we're going to dump some cases, or dump some primers rather, in our little tray here. So we have 25 cases sorted out. That's going to get us through our optimal charge weight test. We'll throw 30 primers in here. And then there's little grooves on the bottom of this tray. So all we do is kind of shake it back and forth until we get them all flipped upside down so the actual ignition portion of the primer is facing up at us. So then we line our cover up, stick it on there, and lock it into place on the tool. So very simple. We just take our case, make sure there's a primer in it, and one kind of safety thing is you want to make sure that this thing is facing away from you. So don't be looking down the mouth of the case like that if you're looking at it when you press the primer in. So occasionally these things will pop. I've had it happen once before. It's not a super common thing, and usually it's because there's some sort of like a rock or debris or something that somehow gets in between the little anvil that pushes the primer in and the bottom of the primer. So you have to be very careful and just make sure it's facing away from you, and you should be good. So all we do is give it a squeeze until the primer bottoms out, and that's it. That's all she wrote. So we'll go run through and do the rest of these. Alright, so we got all our cases primed. This RCBS tool works really quickly and it does a good job. It's just worth mentioning though that there are a lot of different variants of this out there. They all function on the same principles. They got a little tray that has grooves on the bottom of it. It helps you align your primers so they're facing the correct orientation so you can prime your cases. And there's also some fancier reloading tools out there as well. So there's a very nice one made by Primal Rights. It's called the CPS. I believe that is the Competition Primer Seater. Super nice unit. It allows you to adjust the primer seating depth, and there's a couple tools that are very similar to that and very popular amongst the bench rest crowd and the ELR crowd and guys who want to control every single aspect of their reloads. So maybe someday we'll get a Primal Rights CPS in here to review and just kind of check out what benefits and disadvantages it may or may not have. But for now, we finished all our priming, so our cases are ready for powder. So now let's jump on the computer and we'll check out some resources and try to figure out what kind of starting charge and max charge we want to throw in our 6 Creedmoor cases here. All right, we have the laptop out. We have dialed in to 2 different websites here. I have one of them up on the screen. This is the Hornady load data little portion of their website. So I'll typically use one of these more general resources like the Hornady one for determining kind of the popular powders for whatever cartridge I'm going to reload. And Hornady also makes some really good books. I have a couple of them over here, and they're constantly updated with the newer cartridges. The ones that I have over here do not have any 6 Creedmoor data, so we're not going to take a look at them, but those are a great place, a great resource to figure out kind of a general range of powder charges that you should be in and what powder charges are most popular. And a lot of times they'll even list the most accurate powder for that particular cartridge, which is nice. So that's typically what I will go for. That being said, we're going to use Hodgdon H4350 for the 6 Creedmoor. Generally speaking, you want to use the slowest burning powder for the cartridge that will give you the best performance. So try to avoid using these ultra fast powders, especially if you're using a longer barrel. So the longer barrel means the longer time that the bullet is exposed to the powder burn and the pressure that's built up from the powder burn. So we want to have 100% powder burn, so we have all that efficiency driving the bullet out of the barrel for the best velocity. So 4350 is just a very good kind of universal powder for cartridges like this. I use it in 6.5 Creedmoor, so it was kind of a natural transition to use for 6 Creedmoor for me. And I have quite a bit of it, and it's all in the same lot, which makes things very nice. So to determine our starting weight, there's a couple things we have to consider here. So I always go to Hodgdon's website or whatever powder manufacturer that I'm going to use for reloading, and I use their data. So I figured that those guys know more about the gunpowder and the product that they're producing than anyone else. So you can go look at someone else's data, a bullet manufacturer's data, and they might list data for that particular powder, but it might be safe. It probably definitely is safe, but I like to go use the powder manufacturer as my resource for figuring out my initial starting charge. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of inside information here though. So for the 6 Creedmoor that we're loading here, I've previously loaded for this cartridge with the same chamber reamer that we have in this new rifle. So I have a really good idea of what load is going to shoot, all things being equal, if this chamber is set up exactly like the other one, which it is. So they're within a couple thousandths of an inch, and the load should be very similar. So that being said, we're going to shoot 115 grain D-Tacs. Now, I went through and I figured out my bullet seating length based on distance to the lands and a bullet seating length that would also fit in my magazine. So I can load the 115 grain David Tubb D-Tacs at 20 thousandths off my lands and still fit in the magazine just fine. So that's what we're doing. I loaded a dummy cartridge up and kind of measured the overall length, not to the ogive, but from the head to the tip of the bullet, and compared that to what the SAMI spec was or the overall length that was in the reloading manuals, and kind of saw where I was. And based on what I can see, I have a little bit extra case capacity in my particular setup, which tells me that I can afford to put a little bit more powder over what the book max says. Now, this isn't always the case, and I would urge you to creep up on a higher number over book max very, very slowly and very, very cautiously. But I have previous experience with this cartridge, so we're going to start a little bit over what the book is telling us the max is, because I know that it's a safe powder charge for this cartridge we have here. So let's take a look at what we have on the Hodgdon website and the Hornady website, and we'll talk about some of the things that we see there. All right, guys, here we have Hornady's load data. Now this is some very, very basic load data. This is all for free. If you just go to Hornady's website or do a Google search for Hornady load data, this is what you're gonna find. Their books that they put out have a lot more data, and they have a bunch of different bullet weights listed, a bunch of different powders listed, and a lot more information. So this is very, very basic stuff, and it kind of gives you guys a kind of a glimpse at what to look for. So we're looking for 6 Creedmoor. And here we come down, we find 6 Creedmoor in our list. And they only have one bullet offering 108 grain ELD match, which is pretty close to the 115 that we're using. They have a very, very similar bearing surface. Here's our max overall length, 2.79 inches, and the powder that they chose is, big surprise, Hodgdon H4350. And over here we have our first, this is their minimum powder charge, or their starting load that they call it. And they have that at 35.4 grains, which I can tell you from experience is extremely low. And they have that listed at 2,700 feet per second through a 24-inch barrel. So then we come over here to the red column that looks big and scary, and this is our max load and max velocity. And take this with a grain of salt, because this may or may not be the max for your particular barrel. So we have our 41.7 grain charge for Hodgdon H4350, which allegedly gives us 3,050 feet per second with a 108 grain ELD match, and they have that listed as max. So my previous pet load for my 6 Creedmoor was 43 grains of Hodgdon H4350 with the 115 grain David Dub DTAC at 20 thousandths off the land. So that was giving me groups that were sub quarter inch and some pretty incredible velocities and zero pressure signs, super easy on the cases and everything else. So we're going to start off with that number, but if you don't have that previous experience, use resources like this to determine where you should be and what powder you should use. So while we're on the computer, let's check out Hodgdon's website. This is one of my favorites. So we click on a rifle here, since we're reloading a rifle cartridge, and we'll go find 6 Creedmoor. And as you can see, this website is constantly updated. They have all of the new stuff. Here's 224 Valkyrie, there is 22 GT, there's 6 ARC, 24 Nosler, 6 GT, and here we have 6 Creedmoor. So we'll go down and we will select, let's select a couple bullet weights so we get a little bit more information. We'll go 110 grains, 112 grains, 115 grains, and here's our powder manufacturer. So they actually list powder or load data for different powder manufacturers. So we'll choose Hodgdon and we'll leave that. We'll select all of those so we can get an idea of some other powders we can use, and we'll update our data. So not a whole lot of data here, but here we can see for our 115 grain, looks like this is a Burger VLD target bullet. They use Hodgdon H1000, which is pretty slow powder compared to 4350, and they're looking at 2944 for a max load with 48 grains of powder on board. Then we have our Hodgdon H4350 load here, and we're looking at a 40.5 grain max load, and that gets us 2895 feet per second. And these max loads are all based on this pressure right here. So part of SAMI's spec is the pressure, the max pressure for a cartridge, and that's what these max loads are based on. So they do testing with little copper crush washers and some testing apparatus that determines these pressures based on the powder charges that you see here. So there's a couple other powders listed, H4831, which I mess with occasionally. I've never messed with hybrid 1000V, and I have a little Superformance here, but I don't load that in 6 Creedmoor. So you can kind of go through here and see the range of velocities that you get from your maximum loads and the powders that are available for that cartridge. And if you want more data than just this 115 grain data, feel free to look at the 100 grain data. That's very close, and I would feel comfortable using this data to load a 115 grain bullet as well, or at least as a starting charge. So there's that. Now let's get started with putting a little pen to paper and figuring out our starting charge and where we go from there as far as our optimal charge weight method. Alright guys, we're going to do this on a Word document here on the computer, just so you guys don't have to deal with my handwriting, and it'll make it easier for you to follow along. So I have up here 6mm Creedmoor, and we've determined that our max charge based on previous experience, not any sort of stuff that we saw in a book or on the internet, is 43 grains for this load. So from there, we need to dial it back to determine our first 3 charges for the optimal charge weight test. So we're going to take 10% off of 43, which is technically 4.3 grains, but we're going to round it to a whole number, and we're just going to take 4 grains off of our max charge, which gives us 39 grains. So that is our first Fowler. So from there, we're going to add 2% to that, which is roughly 0.8 grains, and we're going to land at 39.8 grains. From there, we're going to add another 2%, which is another 0.8, and we're going to land at 40.6 grains. All right, so those are our 3 fouling cartridges. We only load one of those each, and we're going to use those to foul our barrel. We're going to use those to make sure that our point of impact is good and we're ready for our test. And they're also very good indicators of how your rifle is going to tolerate pressure. And if you have any sort of weird abnormalities in your chamber that make a pressure spike at this low and conservative powder charge, then you know that you got to pack it up for the day and go home and maybe reevaluate what you have going on. So from here is where we get into the actual optimal charge weight test, and we determine our incrementally increasing powder charges till we get just above our max charge there. So from 40.6 grains, I like to add 1% over that. So that's going to be roughly 0.4 grains. So that gets us to 41 grains for our first powder charge. Now from there, I'll add another 1%, which is another 0.4 roughly. So we have 41.4 grains. And we'll add another 1% on top of that for 41.8. Add another 1% for 42.2. I'll add another 1% for, let's see, 42.6. And we'll add another 1% for 43.0. And let's see, how many is that now? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you see we hit our max charge right there. So I like to go either 1 or 2 charges over max. And when we do the test, we creep up on this. So if you see powder or you see pressure signs here at 42.2 grains, that's when you know to shut it down. You don't go past that and try to see what happens. That's when you get into doing dangerous stuff. So we'll go 1 past 43 grains and we'll go to 43.4. And that's it. So for each of these, we're going to reload 3 cartridges. So each powder charge in this little column right here that you see from 41 grains to 43.4 grains gets 3 cases loaded with those charges. So we'll end up with a total of 21 rounds for our actual optimal charge weight test. And I like to have an even number when I do stuff. So I load 25 rounds up. So if you add the 21 plus the 3, that gets us 24. So what I'll do is I'll add 1 more into one of these charges. So I'll have a total of 25 rounds. So we'll have 4 foulers and then 21 charges from our actual test. All right. So pretty simple, you guys, and you can use the load development worksheets that I have up for download. They're free on the website, so check those out. They help kind of organize things and track what you have going on, and we'll see those in some of the future episodes. But for now, we're just going to use this. And typically, the way I do this is I just have a little notebook, and I'll write down all this information in the notebook while I'm doing the load development, and then when it's done, I go back and I transfer all that data into a computer document where I have it all saved, so I can pull it up and it's kept up to date and it's all accurate. So let's get to dialing in our powder scale right now, and we'll start powdering up these cases. All right, guys, we're just about ready to charge up our cases. We have everything we need right here on the table in front of us. So I'll go over some of the stuff you see real quick just to recap. We have all of our prepped and primed, once fired Lapua brass here ready to go. We have our brand new 1 pounder of Hodgdon H4350. That's our selected powder for this test. We have our powder scale here. I'm using an A&D FX120i. It's been leveled out. It's hooked up to a voltage conditioner, so I have a very stable power input that gives us much better scale drift and keeps things a little bit more stable here as far as the electronics go and the scale. And up here, I'm using a auto throw setup on the A&D, and then have an Ingenuity Precision trickler right there. This whole combo is just absolutely phenomenal. It's fast, it's accurate, and it does a great job. So here I have my phone out. This is set up with the Auto Trickler app, and what this does is interfaces with the scale. So all you have to do is type in your target powder charge and you press go. Simple as that. So if we remember back to what we just did on the computer, our first powder charge was a Fowler at 39 grains, so that's what we have input, and we'll creep up to 39 grains right here. So if you guys can see that, we have 38.98, and it's teetering between 38.98 grains and 39 grains, which is where I want to be. I allow for plus or minus 0.02 grains of accuracy for my reloads, and that's what the scale is set at. So 0.02 grains, to put it in perspective, is one kernel of H4350 here. One single kernel. So that's the kind of accuracy that we're getting. So we're within plus or minus one kernel of our target, which is accurate enough for what I need to do. I've tested this stuff and I've never seen a verifiable difference in what happens if I get the powder charge exact versus plus or minus 0.02 grains. So here we have our first powder charge done at 39 grains, and that's going to go in one of these 4 Fowlers here, and I work my way from least to most. So we'll start up here, we'll dump our 39 in. And then we have to reprogram our scale, make sure the powder goes in there. We have to reprogram our scale to our next powder charge at 39.8 grains. And as you can see, this thing is super fast, and that's going to go in our second case here. And we're at 39.78, 39.8. Exactly dead on. And we'll go ahead and load 2 of those guys. I mentioned I'd randomly just pick one powder charge to load 2 of, so we have 4 Fowlers all together. So we'll have 2 at 39.8. And there we are. Then we'll reset our scale for our next incremental powder charge, which is 40.6 grains. So here we go. So after this, we'll be on to our optimal charge weight groups here. So we're going to start out, and each of these rows of 3 get the same powder charge, just to clarify if that was unclear in what we talked about a few minutes ago. So there's our last Fowler at 40.6 grains. So we'll reset our scale for our first OCW load, which is 41 grains even. So we'll set the scale up for that, 41.0, and we'll go. So I do it in rows like this, so it's easy to keep track of. If you have another method to kind of keep track of what's going on, then do that. Whatever works best for your brain, but I go incrementally increasing. So I start out at the lowest powder charge here and end up at the highest powder charge here. And same thing with my Fowler. So this is the lowest charge and this is the highest charge. And we have all that information over there on our computer screen that I can print out and take it to the range if I need to, or I can just jot it down. But I don't mark my brass. I don't do anything like that. They stay in this order right here, even when I seat the bullets, as you'll see in the next episode, but they stay in this order so everything is consistent and accurate. So we have our first powder charge done for our OCW test at 41.02 grains, which is right where we want to go, and we will load 2 more of those. All right, guys, so there we have it. We have our first 3 loaded for our OCW test with 41 grains of powder even. From here, we'll reset the scale. We'll drop 41.4 grains of powder here. We'll go 41.8 grains, 42.2, 42.6, 43.0, and finally 43.4, which is 1% over our max at 43 grains. And then we have our 4 Fowlers that are already charged up here. Very simple process as far as the actual mechanical process of dumping the powder into the cases. All it takes is a little bit of prep to figure out your powder charge range that you want to be in, and your starting charge and your max charge. So nothing here is a mystery. It's all pretty simple once you do it a few times. Just use caution, and when we're shooting the OCW test, which will be in a few episodes, you'll see how we creep up from the lowest powder charge to the highest powder charge, and we will stop and cease all of our load development right there if we have any sort of pressure signs. If the pressure signs are minor, we might push past for 1 more powder charge. But if the pressure signs are serious, like you're getting a really stuck bolt or some real serious markings on your case head, then we'll stop right there and we'll make a note in our reloading book that shows that that is our new max powder charge, and then we'll adjust our load development based off that so we don't dip into that high pressure range at all, and we get a good safe load that we can shoot without worrying about blowing our face off. All right, guys, so that wraps up episode number 4 of the Precision Rifle Reloading series. Just a little recap of what we did today before we go. We started out with our nicely prepped brass from episode number 3. We threw some primers in the bottom of it. We are using CCI number 400 small rifle primers. And from there, we determined our starting powder charge with some online resources that I showed you guys. Then we jumped over to a Word document where we used that starting powder charge in our max powder charge to determine our optimal charge weight test charges. So we came up with 7 different charges for our OCW test, and we loaded 3 of those each. So we have 3 cartridges for each powder charge that we're going to test, and we have 4 fowlers at much lower powder charges just for safety purposes, for fouling purposes, and to make sure that our zero is right where we want it to be. Overall, it's a pretty simple process. You just have to use a little caution when you're determining these starting loads, especially if you don't have experience with that rifle, that cartridge, etc., that powder, whatever it may be. So creep up to these higher numbers. Go slow when you do this, and we'll cover a lot of this when we actually shoot these rounds downrange and we go through the optimal charge weight method. And I'm hoping that we might see some powder charges at maybe our top load at 43.4 grains, so we can kind of discuss what happens at that point in the testing. But overall, we're moving along steadily, and next week we'll have our bullet seating episode where we talk about everything we need to know about seating a bullet in our nicely freshly charged case. So we'll talk about some die selection stuff. We'll talk about how to find our bullet seating depth and what effect that has on your case capacity, your chamber, your accuracy, all that stuff. So it should be a pretty interesting episode. I'm trying to break these up into smaller segments so they're easier to watch, so you don't get bored watching a 1-hour episode. But until next time, you guys, have a great rest of the week, and I'll try to get episode number 5 out on probably Saturday or Sunday. So look for that. If you haven't hit the like or subscribe button, please do so. It helps me know that I'm putting out content that you guys like, and also you'll get the notifications when new episodes are released. So it's a win-win situation for everyone. Until then, you guys, have a good one. Thanks for watching. See you next time.